Well, the contract of sale. So we shall be talking about the essential nature and definition of this contract and some of the conditions necessary as far as the essential concept of sale is concerned. Well, now I have given you short notes. Now there you can see some of the definitions for the essential concept of sale. Sale has many varieties, but all of these varieties have this unifying concept, what is regarded as the concept or essence of sale. So at the essential level, how can we define the contract of sale? So I have given you several definitions. You can find out more from your material. But if you look at these definitions, in many of these, you will see reference to property or mal or commodities, because sale essentially requires exchange of property. Now, I use the word property in the sense of mal, which we shall explain. So, property, commodity, or wealth is essential for the contract of sale. So, you will see here that this contract requires an exchange from two sides. So, the contract of sale happens or takes place between two parties, two sides, where properties or wealth are exchanged from one to the other. So each party gives a type of property and each party receives a type of property, and this is done or this takes place contractually, which means that it is not giving by each party individually. Each takes place against the other. So in most situations, it will be some form of asset on one side and money or currencies on the other side. The overwhelming majority of contracts of sale takes place in this manner. Some asset on one side and money on the other side. But it does not mean that the concept of sale is limited to money and assets only. So that's why we are discussing about the concept of sale that involves exchange of types of property or types of wealth one against the other. So because of this, you will see that almost all definitions referring to sale refer to mal or property, because property is essentially involved. Property has to be exchanged. And also you'll notice the term exchange figuring prominently in these definitions. Exchange, or directly transfer of ownership. So I think in my short notes I had given you some more definitions. These are, I have referred to the schools of Islamic law from whose sources these definitions were obtained. It does not mean that these definitions are drastically different one from the other. It's only because the source from which the definition was obtained belonged to that school. The name of the school is given. If not, essentially, the definition of sale is overall similar. Well, so reference to exchange is vital, because an exchange takes place in a contract of sale as against giving or transferring from one side only. I'll try to draw a diagram to explain this in a while. So exchange is vital because in the contract of sale, exchange takes place, and reference to property is vital. And this property is exchanged one with the other. So two forms or property is extended from two sides. And this extension of property is for the purpose of realizing a specific end. So as in our definition of contract, we said the definition of contract refers to the consequence realized as well. Now, what is the consequence to be realized through a contract of sale? It is transfer of ownership. You see? Achieving transfer of ownership is the whole purpose of the contract of sale, but the ownership is not transferred and not acquired for free. It is coupled with and is conditional to obtaining another form of property. For instance, the seller transfers ownership of the goods against acquiring ownership of the price. So transfer of ownership takes place from both sides mutually. So at the end of this contract of sale, each side had lost ownership of what he had and acquired ownership of what the other party provides. Well, so reference to exchange, reference to property from both sides, and reference to ownership or transfer of ownership. You will see these in almost all definitions. Well, now in this second definition, you see reference to exchange here and reference to property or commodity here and reference to transfer of ownership here and reference to perpetuality, the exchange of a commodity or mal or property against a commodity by way of transfer of ownership perpetually. Who can tell me what perpetually means? Perpetually? Ever heard of that?
Continuing.
Continuing, yes. The precise meaning here is that the transfer of ownership takes place here without being limited to any time frame. This means that the transfer of ownership takes place here forever and not to a limited duration. So each contractor in a contract of sale transfers ownership of his counter value permanently, forever. And this is, perhaps I mentioned in the first semester, an essential feature in a contract of sale. Okay, so let's see here. It is exchange of one type of property against another, and transfer takes place mutually here. Each side, let's say A and B, both parties transfer and receive. A transfers his item, the type of property he provides, to the other, and receives ownership of the type of property provided by the other party. So if A is the seller, he will be usually transferring ownership of an asset. And if the B is the buyer, he will be transferring ownership of money. Well, so this transfer of ownership takes place permanently or forever without being limited to a time frame. Now, this term or this qualification is found in some definitions. It does not mean that, although it is found in some definitions, it does not mean that in other definitions this is not intended. Whenever transfer of ownership is mentioned in the context of sale, it should be understood that the transfer of ownership here is absolute and permanent, because there's no possibility of transferring ownership for a limited duration in the contract of sale in Islamic law. The ownership obtained and the ownership transferred in the contract of sale is always permanent. The buyer becomes the permanent and absolute owner of what he purchases. You see? And the seller becomes the complete and permanent owner of the price he receives. So this is why sale for a limited duration has no recognition in Islamic law, because this is contrary to the concept of transfer of ownership. Ownership, whenever it is transferred, has to be permanent and complete and cannot be tied up to or with a limited duration. Well, now, so perpetually it is mentioned here, but it is intended in the other definitions as well, because when we refer to transfer of ownership, it means that transfer of ownership always takes place perpetually. Well, now in the third definition, transfer of ownership of a monetary asset, again our reference is to mal. You see, we cannot discuss mal at detail here. Well, I'll try to shed some light on what mal is. Well, so mal is mal. In fact, our university offers a separate course on mal itself. So mal is property, and briefly we can say this is any entity from which a recognized benefit can be derived. All those entities, all those assets, be they tangible or otherwise, from which a recognized benefit can be derived, can be referred to as mal. All assets, all things that we see, and all the other entities through which benefit can be derived, such as, let's say, electricity, gas. Okay? So all of these come under mal, because from these recognized benefit can be derived. So the contract of sale always involves mal from both sides, usually money from one side and any other form of mal on the other side. Well, if you look at this third definition, you will see that it is to transfer ownership of a monetary asset, which means mal, or a permissible usufruct or benefit permanently against a monetary substitute. This is another definition. Transferring ownership of monetary asset or a permissible usufruct. Usufruct or benefit. Well, usufruct or benefit is in fact the subject matter of a contract of lease. You see, through a contract of lease or rent, you obtain the right to, for instance, use a car, use a house. So the utility or use or benefit of that asset is obtained through a contract of ijara or lease, or through a contract of hire, you obtain the right to benefit from the effort or work of the employee, for instance. So both of these come under usufruct. So exchange of usufruct against money, it is usually a contract of lease or contract of hire. But in some instances, this can come under contracts of sale as well. This is when that usufruct is transferred absolutely and permanently, perpetually, forever. When usufruct is transferred without any limitation as to the duration or period, then such an exchange comes under contracts of sale. So when usufruct is transferred up to a limited period only, then that comes under contracts of a lease. You see, so we shall discuss about this once we come to discuss the contract of ijara. So well, so we said that in a contract of sale, the transfer takes place from both sides, usually an asset against another asset, usually money. Okay, so this exchange is vital. But when you say exchange, you should understand here that we are talking of the contract. How do contracts take place? Who can tell me? Anyone remembers anything that transpired last semester? Yes, Mr. Arifuddin, if you are here, can you tell me how do contracts take place?
When there is offer and acceptance.
Mr. Arifuddin? Is he here? Yes, problem with mic. Mr. Rifki Shazwan. Yes, these are our colleagues who have come from the other class because their names are not familiar. So which means I can have some hope that they'll take some effort to study. Mr. Rifki Shazwan, are you here or not? Okay, class reps take note. Unless if they have some mic problem.
Sir, I believe Rifki Shazwan went to the toilet just now. Yeah, he's in the same room with me.
Very good, thank you. And Mr. Arifuddin? Mr. Adam? Yes,
Yes.
this is our first day. I didn't expect this on the first day itself.
Yes. Okay.
Mr. Who are you?
Adam.
Mr. Adam, so can you tell me how do contracts take place?
I know it is the it happens when there is a offer and acceptance of a certain object between two parties.
Okay, very good. So contracts take place through expression. Okay? Expression through any suitable mode, indicating their will to create and establish the contract. So when we say that sale is exchange, you see, are we referring to one party giving the asset to the other and receiving the cash in return? Is it exactly what you are referring to when you say sale? The definition of sale says it is an exchange of mal against mal, property against property, you see, by way of transfer of ownership and all that. So does it mean that sale is to hand over an asset and receive another asset in return? Remember that this is not what we mean. We are talking of a contract here. So the essence of sale is the creation of these expressions. The creation of these expressions through which the transfer of ownership from each party takes place to the other. We do not mean actually handing over the asset and receiving the other asset in return. We are talking of expressions. Expressions through which each party transfers ownership of his counter value to the other against receiving ownership of the counter value from the other party. So it is the expression that accomplishes it. So this is why last semester we took pains to explain that the conjunction of expressions, if you remember this diagram, at least who were unfortunate enough to be in my class, the conjunction of expressions. Now this results in the creation of the legal effect, and this legal effect is realized on the subject matter concerned, if you remember all this. So the creation of this contract by the proper taking place of the expressions, now that results in creating the legal effect, and the legal effect is realized on the subject matter, based on which the transfer of ownership takes place. So this transfer of ownership of each counter value to the other takes place as a consequence of this contract or exchange of expressions. So remember this very carefully, which is that we are talking of a contract. A contract takes place through expressions. So once the proper expressions are created, now they result in legal effect, and this legal effect is realized principally on the subject matter. And because of this, because of the contract that took place, now the ownership of each of these counter values transfers to the other party. So at the conclusion of the proper creation of a contract of sale, fulfilling requirements, clarity, giving all the necessary details so that there does not remain in ambiguity, and a conformity, offer and acceptance being corresponding to each other, as we mentioned, and taking place in the same session so that they can join with one another. So once the contract is created, first step. Second step, creation of legal consequences, and consequences are realized on the subject matter, and at that point this transfer of ownership takes place, and this is what we are referring to in the definition. So achieving this mutual transfer of ownership is the purpose of the contract of a sale. So at the conclusion of a proper contract of sale, transfer of ownership is realized. If you have some memory, you will remember that I tried to put a lot of emphasis on this. In Islamic law, sale results in transfer of ownership. Sale results in what? Sale results in transfer of ownership. So never ever say, at least in this subject, never ever say that after the contract of sale, now the contractors have to transfer ownership. What's wrong with that? Who can tell me? What's wrong with saying so? If we say that after the contract of sale, now the contractors, the buyer and the seller have to transfer ownership, if we say that, what's wrong? Anyone who was listening so far? Or at least listened last semester?
Because the possession did not transfer.
What do you mean by possession?
When you transfer a property, that means there must be actual possession to be given to the recipient, in this case, the seller or the buyer, the buyer. And without which, although the contract is completed, there's no any actual, actual possession taken place in that situation. So therefore, that would be my view.
Well, if you mean by possession, custody and taking delivery, that
beg
is
your pardon?
another issue.
You said just now in the class that once the contract of sale has been completed, when the transfer of when there's the transfer of ownership only results in Islamic law when there is a payment be made, correct?
We didn't come to payment yet. We're talking of the contract.
Okay.
Yes. If you remain by possession, transfer of custody and delivery, now that is another issue. Okay? That is subsequent step that has to take place. I'm talking of ownership. So what I explained was that through the contract of sale, transfer of ownership takes place. And mutual transfer of ownership is what is referred to as sale. What is sale? As we saw in the definition, it is transferring ownership. Okay? So you'll see here that transferring ownership itself is the sale. So transfer of ownership is achieved through the contract of sale in Islamic law. If sale did not realize, if the sale did not realize transfer of ownership, then perhaps it was never a complete contract of sale in Islamic law, because sale is the name for transferring ownership. Well, because it is the consequence realized through this contract. So this means that if it was a mere agreement to sell, agreement to sell or agreement to transfer ownership later, now those things are not contracts of sale in Islamic law, because the contract of sale in Islamic law is supposed to result in achieving transfer of ownership. Well, now possession, yes, possession. Possession can be used in the meaning of ownership as well, but I prefer to use the term possession to refer to transferring custody, for instance, physically handing over or delivering the asset, putting the asset under the authority of the other party. Now, that is realized later. We'll discuss about all this. Well, so for the moment, try to understand this definition, that the definition of sale always involves reference to exchange and reference to property being exchanged, and the fact that transfer of ownership is realized through this process, which is important. Transfer of ownership is not something that is to be achieved subsequently later, at a later point of time in Islamic law. Sale, the contract of sale, is what results in transfer of ownership. So whether you understood this or not, and if you digested this or not, we can see later. Well, now at the same time, so this transfer of ownership one against the other, this is what is achieved through a contract of sale. Each party transfers ownership against receiving ownership from the other party. You see? Well, ownership, remember again, I think I referred to this earlier, at least last semester. Ownership is something intangible. You see? Ownership is something intangible. So we are not referring to actually receiving or taking possession or taking delivery. We are talking of each party obtaining the complete rights with regard to the entity provided by the other. You see? So this is acquiring ownership. Well, so when this takes place from both sides, one against the other, one conditional to the other, now that is a sale. Meaning the ownership of this is transferred against my receiving ownership of the other entity. A transfers ownership of asset X against receiving ownership of asset Y. When this is the case, it is sale. If it is, let's say, transfer of ownership from one side to the other without the other party giving anything, what can that be? Yes,
A gift, sir.
it's a gift. Yes, any type, any form of gift or donation where transfer of ownership takes place from one side only. Maybe. So, in ownership transferred through a contract of sale, I mentioned that complete ownership is transferred. Complete in every sense. Absolute, complete, and permanent ownership is transferred. So this means that, for instance, in a contract of a sale, the buyer becomes entitled to all the rights related to the goods that he purchases. You see? He can use the item, keep the item, consume the item, transfer the item to another party through a contract of sale or gift, or destroy the item if he so wishes. Okay? So all these rights are acquired. So if any restriction is imposed on the buyer, then it will not be a contract of sale, because total and complete ownership was not transferred. And this is why, as I mentioned, sale for a limited period does not count as a sale at all in Islamic law. Why? Because the buyer in this situation is deprived of many of the rights that he should get as the buyer of the item. The person who purchases, let's say if we use the term purchase for that, for a limited period, now he can't sell it. He can't consume it in such a way that the corpus becomes reduced, you see, and he cannot transfer ownership to anyone else. So his rights are restricted. So the right received through such a limited period sale is not ownership proper. So it is not sale at all. And to differentiate with such a situation, we said in some definitions the term perpetually is specifically added to indicate that the ownership here is transferred without any limitation as to the time duration. Now, this will become clearer once we come to the contract of lease. In the contract of lease, we know that always the usufruct is transferred for a limited period. Limited period. This house is given on rent for, let's say, 2 months, 3 months. You see? Or this vehicle is leased for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. The duration is mentioned. So the moment any duration comes in, we should know that this is not a contract of sale. It is some other type of contract, for instance, a contract of lease. So you can tell me what is the major differentiating factor between a contract of sale and a contract of lease?
As you mentioned, the contract of sale, it is a complete, the person of the buyer is in complete possession of the item. But in lease, I think it is because of the duration. For example, the 3 years, he only has the possession of 3 years. Is it like that, sir?
Very good. Yes, correct. Yes. One of the major differences is that in a contract of lease or hire, there is always a duration mentioned. Whereas the transfer of ownership that takes place through a contract of sale is permanent, and mention of any duration will make sale in fact invalid. The sale contract will not remain a valid legal sale contract in Islamic law if it is limited to any period. Well, so I will stop here. So this was a brief introduction to the definition of the concept of sale. So take time to go through this and digest this and read the material, and more than everything else, you require time to think on this. You see? Until you take time to think and digest, this will not make sense to you. If you just regard or look at the definition printed on the paper, now that is not sufficient. Memorizing it is also not sufficient. You have to try to understand what it means, and later when you come across other types of contracts and before that various forms of sale, then you can compare this general definition with the specific definitions for specific varieties of contract. So today we try to shed some light on the definition of sale along with the involved terminology and terms and some relevant aspects. Well, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor.
So we'll meet
Thank
again
you,
on Wednesday, but we
Professor.
have to have a replacement class this week. So I requested that it be on Friday if possible. So confirm
Yes.
on Wednesday when you want to have the replacement class. So,
Okay.
so thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thanks a lot. So let's meet again. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi, and welcome.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, Doc.
Thank you.